Welcome back for another episode. And today we have a special guest, Brother Ambakisye, reporting live from West Africa. Brother Ambakisye, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be
And
here.
I appreciate you taking out the time. Time difference and everything from continent to continent. So I appreciate you. And if you could, just really quick, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. My name's Ambakisye Dukuzumurenyi. Um, was born in the United States as a part of that 400-year diaspora. I and my wife, we left the US a couple of years ago and we moved to West Africa, to Ghana. My personal professional background is I have a Ph.D. in public policy analysis, master's degree in public administration, and my focus has been in political economy, public policy, foreign policy. Specifically, in terms of public policy, we're talking foreign policy, economic policy, and dealing in education, creative, and critical thinking.
All right, I appreciate that. And I just had a couple of questions, and we'll get into this session. You mentioned critical thinking. Um, I wanted to really touch on briefly why it's important to develop our ability to think critically, especially in relations to some of the topics that you work in professionally, namely international political economy. Unfortunately, without having the ability to see things clearly, we avoid engaging in these conversations logically because a lot of us just haven't developed the ability to process information and to understand it once we do come across it. So I wanted to ask you to explain the importance of critical thought and how to apply critical analysis to understanding international political economy.
Okay. I would start in addressing that question. I would start with a quote from John Henry Clark and Amos Wilson, and then I would take us back several thousand years to the Nile Valley, and specifically to the works of Ptahhotep and the teachings of Ptahhotep. John Henry Clark told us that in his quote, he says, simply put, education is power. When education is properly done, it opens the door to power. A true education has one purpose and one purpose alone, and that is to train the student to be a proper handler of power. I cannot say it enough. Education is all about power, and all education must lead to some kind of exercise of power. A proper education must ultimately improve one's understanding of what power is, how power manifests itself, and how one has to have power in order to be a total human being. Now, that's what John Howard Clark tells us in terms of education, its actual purpose, because it's in education where we should meet with the concept of critical thought, and not simply critical thought in terms of critical analysis, because what we're also talking about is not simply critical analysis, but also creative reconstruction or creative thought. Because with critical analysis, we dissect and we break things down, but it's not enough to simply pull things apart. Then after we've pulled these things apart, we've analyzed it, we now need to reconstruct this and make it of utility to ourselves. So in terms of critical thinking and why it's important and localizing it to global African people, we start with this quote from John Howard Clarke, because when we're talking about education, and when I say education, we're not talking about schooling or education as cultural imperialism. Right now, what we have is not education, but rather it is schooling as cultural imperialism. We do a great deal of schooling, whether it's primary, whether it's secondary, or whether it's tertiary, it is still schooling. Whether or not the person comes out with diplomas or whether they have degrees, whether it's a bachelor's or a master's or a doctorate, it's still schooling. It's not education, because at no point are we engaged in challenging for power. And when we talk about global political economy, we are not talking about a world where everyone simply lives together in peace and harmony. That may be something that is considered an ideal, or personally, I place that into political mythology. The world has never been a world where global political economy has been this thing of peaceful coexistence. That has never been the case. And so when we look at global political economy, you're talking about, in the international political economy, you're talking about the struggle for power. So for people to properly have an education, it must be dealing with power. Otherwise, it's not education. It is simply training, schooling. Because when I use the term schooling, I'm talking about training. So we have a number of people who get degrees and who have these degrees, and they've had some training, but the whole point of having that degree is not to engage in a struggle for power, but it is simply to elevate themselves in the struggle for consuming. So you get that degree because you want to consume more. So when we talk global political economy, we have to understand that we're talking about a struggle for power. And therefore, when we're talking about a struggle for power, and we're talking about power itself, and we are talking about education, well, true education, as John Howard Clarke tells us, has one purpose, and that purpose is simply to train the student to be a proper handler of power. And right now, for global Africans, nowhere on the face of the globe have we been trained, are we being trained to be proper handlers of power. Now that's John Howard Clarke, and I'm taking that quote on education and pulling it over here into global political economy. Now, Amos Wilson also tells us something about this, which will help us to understand the necessity of critical thinking, of creative thinking, creative reconstruction. He tells us, one, that the ultimate function of education is to secure the survival of a people. So John Howard Clarke told us we're supposed to be learning to be true handlers of power. And that power, we're talking about political, economic, social, cultural, military power. Those are just some of the aspects of power. Amos Wilson, on the other hand, is telling us that the ultimate function of education is to secure the survival of a people. So now, if a people are going to secure their survival, then they must assume power. They cannot be an appendage to someone else. You can't be a vassal and in service to someone else. If you, as a people, are going to survive, then you must have power. And you don't ask your way to power. Power is seized. Now, Amos Wilson also tells us that knowledge must be welded to a sense of purpose, peoplehood, and destiny. Then it becomes protective of your survival as a people. It is measured by how it protects your survival as a people, which is what we're calling nationhood. Now, lastly, because, Amos Wilson is telling us, lastly, what we want to see, we want to look at in terms of power and education and global political economy, where Amos Wilson says, what problems must we solve as an African people? Our problems include the problems of being dominated, not controlling our nations, being poor in the midst of affluence. What goals do we want to reach? What quality of life do we want to enjoy? What kind of people must we become in order to solve the problems that we must solve as a people? What institutions must we develop so that we can act in terms of our interests? What kind of social and educational experiences must we expose ourselves and our young to become the kind of people we need to become to solve the problems we need to solve? Unless education, politics, and economics are designed to solve our problems as a people, they are pointless. What kind of education and knowledge and information and skills and so forth must we develop so that we can build the institutions, develop the relationships and the attitudes to be the people we need to be? Now, we're talking about problem solving. We're talking about education. So when we get into this subject matter of global political economy, which is a struggle for power, global political economy, where we're dealing with politics and economics on a global scale, and we're talking about the survival of ourselves as global African people, if we're going to deal with power, we're going to solve problems, we must master critical thought. We must master critical analysis. We must master creative reconstruction, creative thought. These are things we must do. Now, when we go back to the Nile Valley civilizations and we look at the text, the teaching of Ptahhotep, what we understand here is the discussion in that text is dealing with excellent discourse. And in the text, they tell us that in order to develop excellent discourse, you must be able to hear, you must be able to listen, you must be able to think. And in order to do that, you must have the proper information and a proper grasp of that information to do these things. So critical thinking is actually, critical and creative thought is central to being human. It is central to being alive. If I cannot think correctly, I cannot act correctly. If I cannot act correctly, I will not be acting in my own interests, in the interests of my people. So
Well,
that,
go
yes,
ahead. I'm sorry. Finish your thought.
So that's just the beginning of why critical thought is important for what it is that we're doing in terms of political economy. Because we have to be able to see these things critically through a historical lens, and then we must be able to engage in the science of forecasting, of predicting into the future, of projecting and looking into the future, and seeing how we can plot the course that we need to plot.
Understood. Appreciate that. And sorry to interject real quick, but I did have a question. How have we as a people, I guess, been barred from or denied access to the tools necessary to develop not just individually the capacity to master critical thought and critical analysis, but can you just explain from your perspective how we've been denied access, been denied the ability, and how as a people we have to develop those institutions on our own.
Well, in terms of ourselves as a global African peoples, where we're found on the world, wherever we are found in the world, we are a people, as Amos Wilson said, we are dealing with the problem of domination. We have to accept the fact that in the last great contest between ourselves and the Eurasian, we lost. Everything that we are seeing with ourselves, every social problem, every political problem, every economic problem, stems from the fact that we have lost power because we are a conquered and dominated people. We must begin there. Now, whether it was the centuries of enslavement in the Western Hemisphere, whether it was the centuries of enslavement in Southwest Asia, whether it was the centuries, it's been the less than a century of conquest and colonization on the continent, we have lost power. We are not in power. Right now, the nation states that we have, whether they are on the African continent, whether they are in the Caribbean, no matter where they are located, these are neo-colonial nation states. They are simply the political contraptions established by Europeans to loot and pillage those particular lands of the resources that are in those lands and send those resources and that wealth into the imperial heartland, into Europe, into the United States. That's the purpose of these political contraptions. Amos Wilson called them nigger boxes because we're not in power. We don't control anything in them. When we look at these neo-colonial nation states, and we are going to be honest about it, we don't control the economies of any of them. Europeans are in control of those economies. You have individuals who will look at the local stock market of their country and all of these things, but it's Europeans that are in control of that. Sure, because we're still stuck in this whole thing of putting a black face. That's what this quote unquote flag independence was. You simply put a black face onto a white contraption. It's a European. So now, the system of quote unquote education that Europeans put in place wasn't education. It was schooling, it was training. And so, in the primary learning methodology, if you will, was rote memorization. And if you are a person who is skilled at rote memorization, and that's the primary methodology of learning that you've engaged, that you utilize, so you've just memorized this and memorized and memorized, that's not critical thought. That is simply memorization. And that's the basis of the system of schooling that Europeans have put in. Also, the information basically falls under the category of cultural imperialism because it's an system of information that has been colonized and has been provided in the secondary level of education, in the tertiary level of education. So that's not going to provide you with the skills that you need. When you look at any Black nation state, anywhere in the world, and you've got these people, even with Ph.D s, you can go to the finest universities. Amos Wilson shared it with us that, you know, you could be a Black person, you could go to Harvard, you could be sitting in that classroom, but you're not learning the same lesson. You're not going to take, you're not getting the same thing. Because for the Black person in any predominantly white institution to be properly educated in that institution, they would have to recognize that if you're studying B.F. Skinner, that Black people are the rats. But a Black person in that system of education doesn't view themselves as the rat. They view themselves as the human being. Complete and total political dislocation. Because they're thinking, you know, but you've engaged in rote memorization, you've memorized all of these high-sounding things about brotherhood and liberty and equality and all this other foolishness, which is, and you know, you imbibe it, you take it in, it's like, oh, and you think you're doing something with it, and you move out into the world and you can't solve a problem.
Mm.
Well, first off, economics isn't a science. It's not a science. And so what happens when you look at the history of that subject matter as it's put before us, and you go in, you look at the textbooks, you can look at any economics textbooks, you know, and they're going to start you off with a marginal analysis, and you're going to deal with opportunity costs. You've got all these, you know, concepts from microeconomics, and you're moving to macroeconomics, you're getting into Keynesianism, then you're going to look in monetary, you know, it's not a science. First off, and that can be a problem in terms of the subject matter just itself. As far as those of us maybe who supposedly are supposed to be specialists in the subject matter, that's going to be a problem because if we specialize in economics as the subject matter as it is, economics falls right there with what Amos Wilson was saying about business. He said you could tell the quality of the education based upon what's going on in the community. So the more people you turn out who have the business degree, who have this economic background, the more economically backward the Black community, the Black nation states are.
Mm.
There is a strong problem with what's being called economics. Economics is a Eurocentric academic discipline that is an outgrowth of European global imperialism over the last 6 centuries. That's what economics is.
Mm.
What that subject matter does is it perpetuates the continued military, religious, and political and economic domination of global African people, the entirety of the global South. That's what that subject matter is. So if you get a person of African descent who's in economics, that's what they're going to be versed in. Will they know that? No, they're not going to, because they've taken the course and, you know, they've been told that they're brilliant and they're edited and whatnot. But no, economics is not a science.
Mm.
The subject matter of economics is human beings. It's a person. But the assumption is that, oh, these are economic laws and this is universal and it's no, economics is not a science. It's never been a science. It has always been a methodology that they have employed to extract wealth from people they've conquered. Go back to 1066 of the Common Era in the UK, when William the Conqueror comes over from France and after combat seizes the English throne. And then, you know, he brings in additional nobles and they place them here and around in different places in the UK. The economics, it was an economics of extraction, and that's the basis for the subject matter of economics that you have here now that was codified and laid out and studied and whatnot by Adam Smith. It's coming out of an imperialist background because they wanted to extract the wealth from the land first. That's what imperialism is all about. That's what the subject matter of this economics is. When the the British eventually went into Ireland, one of the earliest things that they did when they went in there was they started to having the people to tally up, you know, all of the resource and everything. You know, it was, this system was a precursor to what you now have, gross domestic product. Prior to that, it was gross national. You had gross national product, but now it's gross domestic product. And that's simply a means of showing the world, okay, here's all of our wares, here's everything that we have, here's what it's worth. It makes it easy then to extract the wealth from those places. You can see where it is, you can see what the value is, all of these things. So you can't have someone who's African centered if they've mastered imperialist economics, and that's all microeconomics is, that's all macroeconomics is. It's a methodology of imperialism, a means of extracting wealth from these lands. So if you can sit there, a person can sit and, you know, they've studied economics and all of this. Well, you know, they're not going to change the situation whatsoever. Look at the countries on the African continent right now and their interactions with Western finance, with the international financial institutions. They're all the finance ministers in the Caribbean, the finance ministers in the nation states on the African continent. They are all versed in economics and finance and business. You haven't seen anything change. They're doing the exact same things. What, Ghana's been to the International Monetary Fund like 19 times or something. I lose count, 18, 19. But so they've mastered, they've memorized, rote memorization again, but nobody's really analyzed the history of the subject matter itself of what we're calling economics. You didn't see the Romans say we're going to peacefully coexist with Carthage. No. They spent nearly 2.5 centuries at war. The goal was total control. The objective was total control of international political economy in that part of the Mediterranean at that time. It wasn't coexistence. International political economy has been about power struggle. You know, they're talking competition. Competition is not some it's a cooperative activity in a way because you have to agree to certain rules or whatever, but you're talking about competition, you're talking about conflict. Business is warfare. Look at the East India Company. They didn't come, oh, we're going to come and we're going to invest in all of these things in India. No, it's warfare. We're going to do this. If you disagree, they have a private army, all of these things. So if we don't really understand what that subject matter called economics actually is, not a science, but it's a means of ensuring your ability to extract the wealth from a people that you have conquered and continue to dominate. So you see right now, you look at these economic development plans in many of these Black nation states, and they are all a means of sub-integrating, continuing the sub-integration of those nation states into a global political economy that is dominated by Western nations. Now, even if you want to change it and say now you have the BRICS and say, well, you know, they're breaking this de-dollarization. No, you still got the same problem. It's still the same system. You know, you can say multipolarity, a multipolar world and all of these things, because those are the new catchphrases right now.
Yeah.
You know, this is considered revolutionary. You know, they're breaking away from Western hegemony.
Yeah. It's like more like a change of hands, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, right now, you have African countries that are looking at that and it's like, well, you know, South Africa is one of the BRICS and yada, 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 but South Africa's wealth is still controlled by the Boers.
Mm.
They can call themselves Afrikaners, but the finances of South Africa is not in the hands of the blacks of South Africa.
Yeah.
No African nation state anywhere in the world outside of Eritrea do you have the people of that country in control of their own system of finance.
Mm.
Nowhere.
Real quick, you've mentioned in some of our past conversations that having a Western-based education in political economy essentially prepares you to be a handler of that system. You're basically learning how to operate within that system. And this will be our last question. Where do we begin the process of studying political economy so that we're not just actors in it, but we develop the capacity to create something new and something different that gives us the power that you mentioned in the beginning of our talk?
We should center ourselves in the discussion, in the study. We should be the center. We should place ourselves there as agents, active and creative agents. That's not what we're doing now, but that's what it has to be. We're supposed to have, you would have to have scholars who are not simply going to do a superficial analysis of the subject matter and the construction of, you know, research questions that stay within the bounds of the thinking or the thought process that's been given to them. If that's all that's going to occur, then you're not going to get any change. Thomas Kuhn, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, makes a point. He says, a student has constantly before him a number of competing and incommensurable solutions to these problems, solutions that he must ultimately examine for himself. Now, if you haven't properly defined the problem, then you can't get anywhere near the solution that you need. So when we look at what we are doing right now in terms of global political economy, we're obviously not defining the problem as one of powerlessness, as one of domination. At least, definitely not the political elites. The Black political elites, or the Black colonialists, as Chinwezu calls them, they don't see themselves in terms of being a powerless people because they have some degree of managerial control over these nation states. The models of what is considered a well-governed or an economically sovereign nation state they're using is Singapore, the nations in South Asia. They're still using Europe, the United States, Canada. That's their model. All of those Black colonialists or the Black political class, that's the model they're using. So as long as that's their model, then that model has given them a definition of the problem, which states that, well, you know, you don't have the political institutions for capitalism. You know, you need to develop these different institutions that are necessary. You need to dismantle a great number of your traditional institutions that are in place. You know, you need to modernize. Instead of saying dismantle, it's modernizing. Well, all of that is coming from a definition of the problem which is not in the interest of global African people. So really one has to go back to what has been defined as the problem if we as a people want to actually make authentic, true, transformative changes. But right now, the Black political class, that is nowhere near what they're doing, whether it's the Negroes in the United States, whereas it's political class it's in the Caribbean, whereas political class on the African continent. They're seeking strongly to, quote unquote, I guess I'll say, make the nation states that they are managing stronger in terms of the methods, in terms of the theories that they've memorized, that have been handed to them, that are being whispered in their ears by the economic jackals, as in the book, The Economic Hitman, is what he's telling you. It's like these advisors who we see roaming throughout all of the African countries, these are economic and financial advisors who are saying, okay, this is how you do this. So you've got all of those persons there operating on behalf of the imperial powers, who are still imperial powers, whether the Black political class acknowledges it or not. Many in the Black political class are knee deep in their wealth is held outside of the nation states that they're in. It's held in the currencies, and the so-called global currencies, all of these things. So, that class is not even remotely on the path to doing what needs to be done. But if we want to do it, we have to become agents.
And as being agents, you yourself as an educator, I want to continue this discussion. And our next session, I want you to walk us through how you as an educator began to use your analytical processes to take us from where we are today to increase our understanding of this subject matter. So we're going to end here and pick back up. Hopefully we'll plan for next weekend. And can you go ahead real quick and just give the name of the course that you developed and how anyone can reach you who would like to engage in further discussion of this subject matter?
Okay, well, the course that I've developed is a systems view of life, an introduction into revolutionary African political economy. And pretty much what we're doing is we're recentering ourselves in the discussion, and we are completely deconstructing the material that's been given to us, looking at it from a systems perspective.
Right. All right. And I like to call you Seba for doing the work that you do. So Seba Ambakisye, we'll look forward to our next discussion.
All right. Looking forward to it.
All right.